I have a question for you, and be honest with me. Does this make my butt look big? Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix, a great collection of more than 170 cars that tell all kinds of fun stories about the evolution of the automobile in American culture. And this is a fun story to tell, but before we get to it, make sure you like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, if you think I got something wrong, make sure you let me know in the comments down below. So the car we have today is a 1973 Buick Riviera. Always been a big fan of the Rivieras, and this is a very interesting generation from 1971 to 1973. To be honest with you, most people either love this body style or they hate it. There doesn't seem to be much in between. But before we talk too much about this car, let's tell a little history about the Riviera and Buick. Buick had been using the Riviera name as far back as the 1940s, but it didn't become its own model until 1963. Ford, with the Thunderbird, had shown that there was a market for personal luxury cars that cost a little bit more but had a big back seat. GM decided they wanted part of that market. And Buick decided they wanted to change their styling as well. So they looked at something called the XP715. It was a show car, initially developed for Cadillac. It was called the Cadillac LaSalle. Then it became the Buick LaSalle. And Bill Mitchell, who was the head of styling, loved the knife edge style of that. And that's what ultimately evolved into the 1963 Buick Riviera. For 1971, Bill Mitchell decided he wanted to take the styling of the Riviera in a bold new direction, and he wanted to do it with what we today refer to as the boat tail, this big angular thing that comes to the back of the car. Does this look familiar? Yeah, we saw it in the Auburn boat tail Speedster, and most significantly, we also saw it in the mid-year Corvettes, that same style of window, that same back that comes back with that ridge all the way through. Unfortunately, it didn't do what Bill Mitchell was hoping it would do. It really didn't re-energize the Riviera market. Riviera sales were okay, but they weren't spectacular. In fact, this styling was very polarizing. People either loved it or they hated it. And as a result, by 1973, Buick and General Motors decided they needed to go in a slightly different direction. So they actually decided to soften up the styling on the back just a bit. If you compare this one in 1973 to the earlier years, 71 and 72, they have a long tail that comes back. This one, it smooths out just a touch. As a result, well, it was softer looking. But what's really interesting about that is they did that for just 1 year. In 1974, they went off in a completely different direction, a new style. So changing the back of the body, doing all that work was just to make it a little softer for 1 single year to try to improve sales. Didn't really work that much. Let's take a walk around and look at the styling of this 1973 Buick Riviera, and there is one really significant change that happened up front in 1973, and that's this big, huge bumper. That's right, the standard federal 5-mile-an-hour safety bumper up here. It added, as you can tell, about 5 inches to the front of the car, so it was a pretty significant change for that year in terms of the styling. But to be honest with you, it added 5 inches to what was already a really long car. I think the wheelbase on this is about 122 inches, and the length is 223, something like that, inches, which means it's basically about 18.5 feet long. Now, the wheelbase was similar to a Ford Thunderbird from that era, but the overall length was longer than what you would get in a Thunderbird. Now, compare this to the Buick Apollo, which was their entry-level car. The wheelbase was about a foot shorter, and the overall length, well, it was about 2 feet longer than you were going to get if you were buying the entry-level Buick Apollo from 1973. Now, it was designed that way, but take a look at that hood. It just seems to go on forever. We'll show you what's underneath there in just a little bit. A significant styling addition that they had for this generation, that started in 1971, is what they call the sweep spear, this right here that kind of dips down. They also had it in the 1970, not quite as bold, not quite as nice, I think, as they've got for this one, but I love the way it accentuates the angles and the lines right there. The sweep spear was a pretty important part of that. Once again, we talked about that rear window, but when you look at that, boy, doesn't it just look exactly like a bigger version of what you were going to find in a mid-year Corvette from 1963 through 1967. And that same almost Stingray styling that goes all the way down the back to a tail right here. As they did this, as they softened up the styling for this year, one of the things they also did was they took the license plate and put it in the center. In the previous year, I think it had been off to the left side because this angular tail came back so far, that boat tail came back so far that they needed to do that. For this year, they moved it right back to the middle and kept it right where it was supposed to be, or right where people were used to seeing it. Bill Mitchell was not happy with the width of this car. It's actually about 80 inches wide. I think it's about 6 or 7 inches wider than the Apollo would have been. And his concern was that they took, well, he talked about the fact that from a styling perspective, they took a speedboat and turned it into a tugboat. When you see these big flat expanses right here, well, Bill Mitchell really wasn't pleased with the final result, and he thinks that was part of the problem with the design for this. It was just too wide, too big in the back, and as a result, it made the car just look a little too clunky. A big car deserves a big engine, and that's exactly what we have under the hood for this 1973 Buick Riviera. 455 cubic inches, 4-barrel carburetor. Now, unfortunately, just a few years earlier, that 455 was developing quite a bit of power, 360 horsepower. But by 1973, a couple things were coming into play. They decided they need better fuel mileage. Gas prices were getting higher, although today we consider them pretty darn cheap. But gas prices were starting to go up. People were concerned about that. I think this was only getting maybe 11 miles to the gallon back in those days, so it wasn't particularly good. And then, of course, there was the issue with the emissions. Emissions were becoming a bigger concern as well, so they had to do things to try to clean that up. As a result, for example, they had to lower the compression ratio, which also affected the horsepower. Another thing that also happened with this engine is that they were starting to go to what they referred to as net horsepower. It was really an actually better term to be used as opposed to just what the engine could produce. It was what the engine could produce with all of the stuff associated with it on there. So 250 horsepower in some ways was a little more realistic. There was also something called a Stage 1 option you could get. You would pay, I think, like $139 for that, and that would deliver you an extra 10 horsepower. This engine actually replaced remember the nailhead engine? You've heard of the Buick nailhead engine? This is the engine that essentially replaced that as the big block in 1967, just about 6 years before this. It was interesting the way they did this engine, though, to get it out to 455 cubic inches as they evolved from that original 1967 engine. And they did it by actually using what they called thin wall casting. As a result, the engine was not as huge, and more importantly, it did not weigh quite as much as some of the other engines coming out of General Motors at the time. So it had reasonable power, but once again, by 1973, it just wasn't a massive amount of power. But during the mid-70s, well, that's what we refer to as sort of the malaise era, where horsepower was going down. It was really more about the looks of the car than it was the ability to put your foot on that gas pedal and really feel the power coming out the back. One interesting option available on this generation of Buick Riviera was something called the MaxTrac option. It was actually an early version of traction control. It was a computer-controlled device that would prevent wheel spin, and it would actually do it by limiting the engine acceleration. Now, that's very common in cars we have today, but for this generation, it was pretty interesting. However, for 1973, this was the last year they would offer MaxTrac. The Buick Riviera was a personal luxury car, and it absolutely delivered. I mean, getting inside, it is not a sports car, but it has a personal, elegant feel that you get when you get inside and you get to enjoy it. The styling of the dashboard changed pretty significantly from 1970 to this generation, which started in 1971. 1970, kind of a flatter dashboard all the way across. In 1971, they went to, let's kind of call it a 3-panel look with the 2 side panels and then the speedometer in the center. Now, unfortunately, in 1973, they went to a different look in that in 1971 and 72, it had a machine turn look, kind of a metal finish to it. 1973, well, they decided they wanted to change the styling of it, so as a result, they went to a wood grain. Personally, I like that look of that metal turn dash from the previous 2 years. They continued actually this styling for the dashboard into the next generation as well. It's important to point out that they did some things in 1973 to make the car quieter inside. They added more sound deadening. They had better body mounts. This car was quieter and it was smoother than the generation, not just of cars that had come before, that second generation, but even the cars in this generation that had come just a couple years before. Prices were getting up there in terms of what it was costing to add options to this. A significant option was the climate control, which I think was costing $509. And if you wanted an electric sunroof, this one doesn't have it, but if you wanted an electric sunroof, that was $589. To be honest with you, there's not a huge amount of room in the back seat. There's enough. I mean, it's okay. It's better than a lot of Mustangs and Camaros. But once again, this was a personal luxury car. This was about you driving along and enjoying it. I will say, when you look out over the dash, over at that hood, it just seems to go on forever. And there's a point at the front of the hood you can't even see. So looking at this thing as you were driving down the road, it really felt like you owned all the road ahead of you. Base price for the Buick Riviera was $5,221, which made it the most expensive Buick you could get that year. And trust me, people were putting on plenty of options. I mean, the air conditioning was number one. Almost all the cars came with air conditioning. Power windows, that was another very popular option. The power seats, and about 80% of them had the vinyl top as well. Sales for this generation of the Buick Riviera were good, but to be honest with you, they weren't great. In 1969, I think they topped out with those early generations selling more than 50,000 Buick Rivieras. For this generation, 71 through 73, they were kind of stuck in the 30s. I think for 1973, they sold 34,000 of the regular ones, another 1,000, 1,500 or so of the GS versions, those Stage 1 versions. And of course, then they decided to go in a different direction for 1974 with different styling, because, you know, that ducktail just wasn't as popular as they thought it was going to be. But guess what? The next generation did much worse, significantly worse in terms of sales than this generation. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1979, the sixth generation of the Buick Riviera, that they would finally top 50,000 sales again. But boy, this is the end of a generation, right? That massive hood, the 18.5 feet long length from end to end, and of course that unique styling in the back. This was the end of that generation thinking, how big can we go? How bold can we make it? Well, we boldly went where the Riviera had never gone before, and unfortunately, we never went back to that again. Just a fun chapter in the automotive evolution.